Well, thank you very much, Brian. I'm afraid I don't have £500 to give away, and I'm not quite sure how you measure what the best tweet is, but I certainly like the idea of it. So yeah, I'm Johnny Dunford. I work for BNP Paribas. I'm not actually an occupier, but I work with occupiers a lot. So we run a team which is corporate real estate. Some people call it global corporate services. And so basically we're trying to work with occupiers to make their portfolios work better for them. So I compressed the title of this presentation to be What Occupiers Want. So what I'm trying to do is run through a few themes that are happening and some of the things that we're doing to work with big occupiers to try to add value. So first of all, let's just wind our clocks back to 2008 when Lehman's went pop. Now, I use this slide quite a lot because it always sort of amazes me that on the one hand it was a very long time ago, on the other hand it wasn't very long at all. But rather bizarrely, like lots of property cycles, it was 7 years, almost exactly to the day. And a hell of a lot has changed in that 7 years. And despite the fact we've all managed to live through it, lots of things have changed. And remarkably, we seem to be coming out of it into a completely new market. Now, everybody says, of course, it's a new cycle, it's a new market every time we get into one of these 7-year cycles. But it really does feel like there is a new dynamic emerging. And the hypothesis I'm going to put to you today is that actually occupiers are behind a lot of this. And occupiers are demanding things which previously haven't been demanded and therefore need to be taken account of. So when you have a quick look around the world, interestingly, London and the UK are very stable. London continues to be a massive draw for capital. Huge amounts of money pour into London property. A lot of it is equity, so we're not in the same situation as we were 7 years ago. And a lot of it is foreign money. You will have spotted today in the papers, we've got the Chinese here, and we're talking about selling part of our nuclear power generation to the Chinese. Now that's pretty remarkable, but I would be very surprised if there's not a sizable slug of equity in that deal, if indeed it comes off. What about in Europe? Well, Europe is also improving, clearly led by the two big nations of France and Germany, which is great, and it's clearly going to be an area for development. But I think it's very easy for us to forget that there's also some huge problems going on in Europe. This is the Keleti station in the centre of Budapest. I lived in Budapest for 3 years. It's a population of about 1.7 million people or thereabouts, 2 million if you round it up, but it's not very big. And the whole country has only got probably 8 or so million in absolute tops. And so you've got dozens and dozens of people, thousands of people piling up in the centre of town, causing this huge congestion. And this is in Europe, where we've previously, most young people anyway, have got used to the idea of just travelling across Europe with no barriers, no borders. And now we're seeing barbed wire coming back, border controls, and all the rest of it. So an awful lot of things have changed in Europe, and I personally think that it's going to get worse before it gets better. Although some of these things are clearly, exaggerated, it's still not a good place to be. What else? Well, we've got China. We've got the Chinese visiting London, as we've already pointed out. China, of course, for a while was the great white hope. Everybody thought China was going to get us out of all the problems because it was such a massive consumer, but it's now being seen to be not quite so robust. And indeed, as we've also seen, lots of money coming out of China to be invested elsewhere. Greece has been talked about endlessly. Mark Carney talking about what happens in the event of the Grexit or some other combination of odd names and terms. And all of these things combining on the back of the US Fed talking about a rate rise but not actually doing it. But going back to Europe, rather bizarrely, we've got situations where getting across the Channel Tunnel can take you 15 hours because of all the various delays and complications. So, we said that the UK and London are in pretty good shape. I think that's true. But we've also got some of our own risks. Now, whether you love him or hate him, Jeremy Corbyn is now the leader of the opposition. He joined Parliament in 1983, which is the same time as the likes of Steve Norris and Ken Livingstone. Now, again, no political angle to this, but I really wonder whether Jeremy Corbyn thought he was going to be the leader of the Labour Party in his entire political career. Because it feels like a lot of the things he's articulating are frankly a little old-fashioned and he's struggling to keep up. Nonetheless, we've got him and it's important that he is taken seriously. Interest rates, people keep talking about those going in an upward direction, but it seems to be very, very slow. And we've talked about China already. and of course the booming demographics, and particularly in places like the south of England and London, where there's simply not enough houses to go round. I also wanted to touch a bit on technology and the sort of people that are both using technology and what it means to them. So, arguably part of this recession has spawned this group of people who are very, very familiar with technology and the idea of communicating 24/7, anywhere, and all sorts of media within that. So not just text, but also video, sharing documents, pictures, and the like. So the new generation of occupiers is altogether much more sophisticated, much more demanding, and that sort of picture there is actually very common. There are loads and loads of offices around London and indeed around the country where people are literally sharing space on the same benches. And it wasn't that long ago that we said, well, hang on a minute, what about confidentiality? How do I make sure that these people are not nicking my ideas and so on? No one seems to worry about that any longer, because what's on your screen is on your screen, and obviously where you choose to store it is up to you. So those sort of ideas have gone. So a very much more flexible, much more demanding type of occupier. So let's have a look again back in time. This I took out of Forbes magazine about 3 years ago, and everybody said, yeah, okay, commuting, it's all dead. Is it really? Well, I genuinely think it is dead, actually, and I think we will see that the use of the car falling away dramatically. And you see that, I think, in the volume of activity, traffic which is going onto the various public transport systems, particularly rail. Likewise, the way we work has changed dramatically. It wasn't that long ago that this was a sort of traditional desk and a traditional office where you had all sorts of inputs, paper, fax, email, telephone calls, and all the rest, and people had that sort of cubicle type system, and you can see, frankly, it's pretty chaotic. Now, we've all lived through it, we've all been there, we all know it exists, but it's, I think, increasingly unacceptable and increasingly lacking in productivity. And productivity is something which we're trying to work on and trying to develop. So we had the old office, then we had the sort of promise of everybody being free and you could escape and go and sit at home on your veranda or elsewhere on a park bench, but it didn't really work. We saw all those firms like Google and so on, who everybody said were very innovative and very clever, which indeed they are, but we've all done the dress down Fridays, then it's come back. We've done the work from home, it's come back, and people now want to be much more connected with their space, because it also, I think, raises questions, particularly for the FM and security side, is how do you actually make sure you've got the various systems in place when someone's working remotely? And some stats to back it up. This one comes out time and time again, which I find really pleasing, because no matter how many times the survey gets done, it still comes back that only every other desk is being used at any one time. And that's pretty alarming, because obviously we're all paying for all of them, regardless of whether you're using them or not. And then likewise, the number of people who are moving is jumping up all the time. So these numbers come from ISS, who did some work on it, and saying that 37% of the world's workforce is going to be a mobile worker. So they're going to need to be looked after, and they're going to need to have systems and so on in place to allow them to do this kind of work. It also, I think, means that the space which is provided is going to have to be that much more effective. So, translating this into what's happening right now in London is there is a real competition existing now between what you might call the traditional occupier, the suits, the banks, the professional services and the like, and then the more trendy media types who are often in much smaller businesses, but they grow very, very fast. And we've seen this with businesses like Facebook, and Uber is probably the best example of a disruptor that's come into the market and has just literally taken over masses and masses of space incredibly quickly. But interestingly, they are actually competing for the same sorts of buildings, because everybody wants to be well located in good quality space and really effective. And I keep coming back to this theme of effective and productive, because that's what we're trying to measure and that's what we're trying to get to. A little bit London-centric, locations are not what they were. Well, you know, when you go to places like around Shoreditch, there simply are no spare buildings. Never mind a spare building, there's hardly a spare floor plate or even enough room to put a couple of desks. So people are increasingly being flexible about what they want. We did a survey at the end of last year, which got published early this year. I only took out one slide from that survey pack, and the obvious point is that some things don't change. Everybody wants modern space. They want it to be spacious, they want it to be good, and they want it to be effective. But modern keeps jumping out as what people want. The same survey looked at the media tech industry, which used to be called the TMT. And everybody naturally assumes that everybody wants to be hot desking, don't they, and flexible and moving around and so on. Well, it doesn't seem to reflect that, because on this slide, the light green is the new school, so the trendy Googles, Facebooks, Ubers and so on, and the dark green is the ITVs, the IBMs and the traditional media print type companies. But if you look at this, it indicates here that actually people want fixed desks rather than in the media type characters, because they want that security. They also want collaborative space, but then so does the old-fashioned, the old-school industries. So almost the opposite of what you might expect. Then looking at some of the criteria of the space itself, it's a bit of a mixed bag really, because you've got 51% say they want exposed ceilings, well 49% say they want a suspended ceiling. The ones that really jump out as being important are the fixed desks, which we just touched on, and the location. Everybody wants to be well located, and increasingly people are living close to where they're working. So I think what it means for occupiers is occupiers really do get what they want, but they've got to be quite careful about how they demand it. So what we've been trying to do in all of this is to say, okay, so how do we measure how productive this space is? And I think that most people have probably heard of Leesman and the Leesman Index, which measures workplace and how effective they are and how productive they are for those that are using them. It's a very simple system which relies on a survey. You get a score which puts you on the bar, and obviously red is bad, green is good, and you can get ranked depending on your score with your peer group and also by location. Now, this seems to be important to me because occupiers traditionally don't really measure the space they use. They don't really measure the productivity. And we've all had those experiences where you go into someone's new office and they say, isn't it good, isn't it better? Well, better than what? Because it just feels nice, it looks nice, but actually it hasn't made any difference to the productivity. So what I think we're saying then is property really is becoming something for the people. It's something which makes a difference to the way people work and the way they can be productive for the business. There's lots of other aspects to it, I think, as well, like, are we really projecting our brand? Are we making a difference for the rest of the community, and all these other sorts of things, which arguably are not so important as productivity, but they do make a difference when you're trying to bring new people into the business. So just a couple of things around the way Leesman works and the way that we've been trying to put it into play. It's very simply a survey. You ask a load of questions, you get responses which are green if they're good and red if they're bad. So on here you can see the question is, which activity is important to you in your work and how well are they supported? And you can see from top to bottom things like using technical specialist equipment, all the way down middle of the page there's informal unplanned meetings, private conversations at the bottom and so on. So clearly which activities are important to you, and then they get scored. So you can see, for example, on here that we've got individual focused work in the middle and telephone conversations near the top, which are very important to the individual. Then you put a score on it, which describes, in this case, how well are they supported. So clearly red is bad, green is good, and you can see very simply on the bars whether something is good or bad. And the term being used is supported or under-supported. So clearly the implication is if it's under-supported, you need to do something about it. But what happens with Leesman is that's as far as it goes. it's simply a survey. It gives you a measure, it tells you where you are on the graph. Depending on whether you've got lots of buildings or just one, then clearly you can rank your buildings, or you can compare with the rest of the peer group, or you can even break it down if you've got a very large building and do it by floor plates or department or similar. But that's all it does. It simply just measures productivity for that particular building or portfolio. So what we've been doing with our client base is saying, okay, so what do we do next? Because actually that's all fine, but surely you want to do something about it, because you want to get the reds into the greens, or you want to get rid of all the reds completely by disposing of property or having a different approach. And what is that approach going to be? And so we've then taken these findings, we work with the client in a workshop type style, and we stick them into a snapshot which breaks out the major issues. And this isn't populated because I didn't want to share my client information with you because I thought it might be a bit cheeky. But you can see that what we do is you take out the principal findings from Leaseman and you put in some benchmarks which are agreed, and you say, well, for example, this particular building is the one we want to aspire to, or this particular location, and you can put in as many as you like, but 3 is normally sufficient. And then across the portfolio, we just simply do some pluses and minuses to say what's good and what's not good. To really try to get a simple view across the portfolio. Now clearly if you're comparing, for example, one country with another, so you might have a portfolio in UK, another one in, say, Sweden or France or some other country, you can then start to match them up. So that's really quite basic, because that's just giving the basic findings. But what becomes more valuable is you then start to build up a little, almost like a business plan about each of the respective assets. So the way we've been tackling this is to say, okay, so this particular building, the business unit that occupies it does this. Let's just say, for sake of argument, it's a manufacturing plant. The business does this. This is a really important plant for us for the following reasons. We cannot leave here because we've got too much invested here. Our staff all have short commutes because they've all come from the local university, and so on and so forth. And so we try to draw out the key points for the business. And what seems to come through a lot is that because of the recession, people have only been focused on cost. So finance directors have gone to the property director, or if there isn't a property director, just gone to the FM guy and said, just take out the cost, take out the cost, I want less cost, which is fine, but you can only do that for so long. So what's happened is we've got masses of buildings and probably masses of portfolios where there's been a lack of investment. And people have been happy to pay little to keep it running, but now all of a sudden they're beginning to realise they've got to do something about it. And you know, the experience that I had at RICS on the FM side was that people naturally gravitate towards FM, where actually it has probably the least impact of all, because it contributes such a small amount of cost in the longer term. But unless you've got some evidence to go back to the business to say, look, you're really letting us down here because the buildings are not performing, and therefore we've got to do something about it, you haven't got much to go on. So this tries to simply summarise what's going on. There's some property stuff on the right-hand side there about leases, you know, rents per square foot, critical events like lease breaks, any redevelopment type opportunities or similar, and then obviously some numbers in there for what the current market is. So that gives you a quick snapshot of the sort of property play and any projects and so on that are underway. It all gets summarised then into a one-pager. One page is very good because it's easy to understand, and it's very simply a SWOT table, and you put, I call this the smiley face chart because that's what it is, and you simply grade the various things, business, property, occupier, and overall, and you put a face on it. So does it have a strategic impact on the business, i.e. do you have to retain this? Probably yes. Operationally, does it fit? Occupancy costs, a vacancy, and so on. So you go through and you make a very simple analysis based on everything that's gone before. And then with some recommendations which often involve a simple categorization. So most portfolios break into 3 types. You've got the ones you must keep, the must holds. You've got the ones which you don't really need, so they're the get rids. And then you've got the ones in the middle where you're not sure and you probably need to do something about it. And once you start to break them into those sort of three broad categories, it becomes so much easier then to say, right, so we'll keep all of this lot, which means the ones we're not sure about, we can probably shift some of the business operations into those, or we can increase the density or some other combination and start to work a bit more effectively. So that's a quick rundown of what occupiers are doing, how I think the world has shifted, and how I think we need to start to accommodate these new trends in measuring performance and work with them. That's the end of my presentation. Brian, thank you.
My pleasure.